Now let's learn about comments in Python. As some of you might be already aware of, Python comments in any programming language are basically statements like this, right? Which are not interpreted by a compiler or your interpreters. So they're not executed, if I have to put it that simply. And they're typically used to write exploratory pieces of your code to make your code more readable by humans. For example, here you could say this is print hello world to console. So it's saying what this line of code below that is doing. And one of the simplest ways to write comments in Python is to start the line with a hash, with this symbol, which is right above your 3 key on your keyboard, right? So that's the simplest way to write a single line comment. Of course, if you want to write multi-line comments, here is how you can write it. Of course, you can write a multi-line comment like this with hash starting on each line. Or a better way to write it is to actually start your comments with your triple quotes. We saw the triple quotes are used typically to represent your strings, right? Multi-line strings. So you can actually start with triple quotes, and this will be regarded as a multi-line comment. Of course, you can use either single quotes or double quotes. Both of them will work equally well. Now, unlike many programming, for example, in C, if you recall, how do you put a block of code? How do you write a block of code? For example, if I'm writing a for loop in C, I typically might write int I equals to 10, I less than 10, sorry, I less than 100, I plus plus, and I typically put all of this code in your curly braces, right? So this is a block of code. This is how I define that all of this piece of code, whatever I write here, will be executed whenever this for will be looped through using your for condition, using your for loop, right? So what happens is, unlike your C, C++, or Java, uh, Python actually has some indentation which is slightly unique. What it does is, so if this is my for loop, so this is a simple for loop. What it says is for I in range 10. So we'll look at loops in much more detail later. But what this does is basically it goes this is equal to saying for I equals to 0, I less than 10. This is what it literally means. Because when you print it, you'll see that, right? But you don't see your curly braces. You don't see your C's. You don't notice your C program or Java's curly braces here, because what Python uses is an indentation of this sort, where if this is my code flow, if this is the line on which my code is flowing, if I have some gap here, it assumes that till the time the gap is there, it is all part of my for loop. So it uses typically, it's a good habit to use 4 spaces for indentation, right? Some people also use a tab, but it's recommended to use 4 spaces because tabs could be interpreted slightly differently in various text editors, right? So for example, if you look at a code like this, okay, for example, if I write a line like this, let me just edit this code so as to make it interesting, right? So I just said, okay, print I in 1 to range. Now if I just go back here, and if I say print 100, right? So this print 100 here is not part of my for loop because it's at the indentation of for. So everything here, for example, if I change this to print I multiplied by 2, right? So I get my print I and print I print. So both these lines, so 0, 0, 1, 2, 2, 4, 3, 6. So this whole piece of code that is highlighted here is part of my for loop because it is indented at the same level inside the for loop. But my print 100 is not in my for loop. That's important to notice. Then we might ask, what if instead of 4 spaces, I have 1 space, right? So sorry. So I think I mistakenly used a tab here. It's always good to use 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So I could say 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Then the question is, what if I put a single space? So this line now is neither at the for loop nor at the print statements, right? Then what happens? It simply raises an error. It says you have not indented it properly. It's called an indentation error. And your IPython is smart enough to realize that there is an indentation problem and it highlights it in red as you type, right? But you can get rid of this. You can get rid of this problem if you just make this print 100 line start with your for, or if you just make it go inside your for loop, right? So this is a very, very useful way. Let me explain you why. Because this makes your code readable. It makes your code look beautiful and interesting to read. Let me show you an example. For example, this is how your if your if conditional statement looks like in Python. I'll promise you. I promise you that we'll look at the if else conditions in more detail. But there are two ways of writing this if statement. I can say if true, print this. Of course, there are four spaces here, which means both of them will be executed if true. Of course, if true, and hence these two will be executed. I could have written the same thing in just one line like this. And these two statements now are delimited using a colon. When you have a colon like this, what it says is that these two statements need to be executed one after other, and they're on the same line. But this is not readable. If you look at readability or the cleanliness of code, or how easy is it to just flow through your code, this is much less readable. Of course, they both are doing exactly the same thing. But remember, code readability is as important as code correctness. Because when you write code, maybe 100 other people may read your code later. And your code should be in a state that people can easily understand what's happening. The next concept is statements. So statements are basically commands that that your Python interpreter will execute. Okay. So for example, what does this do? It basically assigns a value of 1 to a variable a. This is a simple statement. Let's look at slightly more variations of statements. So this is called a multi-line statement, because your whole statement, your 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6 plus 7 plus 8, is split over multiple lines. So when you're splitting your whole statement across multiple lines, it is mandatory that you use this backslash symbol at the end of the line, telling the interpreter that, okay, what comes in the next line is actually part of the same line, right? So when you execute it, you'll get print a, you'll get 36, which is the sum of all the numbers from 1 to 8. It just works like magic. The other way to do multi-line statements, instead of using a backslash, if you put everything in your parenthesis like this, it understands the moment you open a parenthesis like this or a small braces, it understands that till the time the braces are closed, everything is part of the same sentence, same statement, sorry, and everything will work like a charm. The third type of statements that we will see is you can actually have multiple statements on the same line. In this case, we had a single statement spanning across multiple lines. We could have multiple statements in a single line, probably for brevity or for shortness if you want to write it. If you want to write short, quick snippet of code, this is how you can write it. Of course, here 10 is assigned to A, 20 is assigned to B, and 30 is assigned to C. The most important thing is the semicolons. If you notice, we haven't put semicolons anywhere else, but if you don't put a semicolon here, it will raise an error. It will raise an exception. Okay. As long as you put your semicolon, it knows that, okay, this is one statement, this is another statement, and this is another statement. So the delimiter between multiple statements in a single line is nothing but your semicolon.